All right, we're back. I hope everyone had a great lunch. I hope you're excited about the afternoon because we have some exciting things planned for the afternoon. To just get started, this is an exciting panel, and this is gonna prevent you from getting that after lunch, need to rest feeling. We're not gonna have that because this is an amazing panel. But to start engaging you right away, I want to ask you another question. So I want to ask you a question to start this. So if you do have your phone, again, with the sound off, but I know you have your phone with the sound off, and you want to go back to menti.com, and the code is the same. If you didn't log in this morning, 816754. And here we want to ask you kind of a general media trust question. We want to say, how much do you trust these types of sources to report news accurately? And you can pick from, I believe, 1 to 4. Do you trust them never or just about always? We can't ask a lot of detail. We're not going to make you fill out a whole questionnaire. So we want to ask you, local TV news, news shared by friends on social media, national newspapers, online and in print, and cable news channels. You can answer even if you work for one of these, because you're not going to bias the data. It's fine. You could still be in this data set. So I'll give you a second. Here we go. Got some people. All right, we have 23 people. Not bad. Some people still. This is 4 questions, so you really you need some time to think. You really got to think about all the. Oh, we got 29. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, interesting. So among this room of experts here, in this poll, the highest levels of trust in accuracy were for national newspapers, online and print, followed by local TV news, and that's fairly high. That's close to the average being almost just about always, followed by local TV news. Followed by cable news in the middle. And then news shared by friends on social media last. Although we don't have a lot of real media skeptics in the room. That's interesting to know. They are out there. Trust me, the real media skeptics. But they're not in the room. They're not in the room right now. Among our experts. So this is what is the topic of this panel we are going to start with right now. Trust in the media in general has declined, dramatically since the early 1970s, and it's either the biggest decline in any institution or tied with Congress or the presidency, depending on which year it is. But it's dramatic decline. So I want to introduce this panel, which is going to talk about talk about the changing media environment and its relationship to our trust in the media to provide us with the accurate information we need to make democracy work. So I'm thrilled to introduce my Georgetown colleague, Letitia Bodie, who's going to be the chair of this roundtable to lead our discussion on media and trust. Letitia is a professor in Georgetown's Communication, Culture and Technology program. She specializes in political communication and especially new media. She's published I can't even believe how much she publishes. She's published just a ton. Blows my mind. In political communication, political behavior, media effects, new media, social media, especially the intersection of media technology and politics, and especially social media and how people interact with social media. So Letitia, thanks for being with us today, and I'll let you introduce the panel and get going. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming after lunch. And I think this is going to be a really interesting panel. I think the morning has set us up for this panel very well. So I think that we're going to have a great time. And thank you, John, for inviting me to moderate this panel. So I'll start by introducing our esteemed panelists, which will be a little bit different. So we've had a lot of academic content this morning. We're going to have the people that are actually in the trenches talking to you this afternoon. So I think that will be a different perspective and a really important one. So on my far left is Hadas Gold, who works currently for CNN. I'm going to give very brief introductions, but all of them have esteemed and lengthy resumes that you can look up online. She covers different aspects of politics and business for CNN. To her right is Elizabeth Jensen, who has a lengthy career in journalism and currently serves as NPR's ombudsman and public editor as of January 2015. And to my left is Stephen Hayes, who is the current editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard and has worked for basically every news media outlet you have heard of. So with that out of the way, I thought we would just go ahead and get started. So this morning we heard, you guys took some heat this morning, I feel like. So Elizabeth described media influence as corrosive this morning on trust, and Lily specifically pointed out that the win-loss frame that the media tends to set up is also probably having a negative effect on public trust in political institutions. So I want to start by asking, to steal the title of John's book, roughly speaking, is why do people hate the media? And are there legitimate reasons they have to lack trust in the media, either as an institution as a whole or in this particular moment in time, however you want to interpret that. And we'll just start with Ross.
I mean, sure, you can have whatever reasons you want to hate the media, I guess, and I'm sure they've changed over time. I honestly think it probably depends on who you're talking to and specifically what outlet you're talking about. The trope of, people hate Congress, but they love their member of Congress, I think also applies to the media. People will say, oh, the media is horrible. But if you ask them about Fox News, oh, they love Fox News and everything they say is true. And so I think you can't put out these blanket statements about it. I'm sure you could go back in time and look at how the sensationalization of media might have affected how people view it. CNN was mocked for plane crash coverage and all of that, using holograms during elections, which I thought were really cool. But so that I could see how that affects it as well. And it's just and honestly, social media affects it as well, because that's how a lot of people interpret media nowadays. They oftentimes lump in what you might call mainstream media with what they see on social media. So none of it happens in a vacuum, and I definitely think that you can't just say, like, here's why the people hate the media.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I get frustrated at the questions that are asked. Do you trust the media? And it's like, well, what is it? Is it social media? I mean, I think you have trustworthy media. I think you have untrustworthy media. Very few of the studies I've seen have actually broken down that divide. It just tends to be a general question. The surveys I've seen that have broken it down, local media versus national media, I think people are more likely to say they do not trust national media, but then you say, well, do you trust your local newspaper, or do you trust your local public radio station? And I think for the most part, those numbers are higher. I think that's probably because you can see the outcomes, right? So you hear a story on NPR and you don't know whether the story is true. If it's a story about national government, you just don't know, right? You don't have the evidence in front of you to be able to evaluate the truth of that story. If you're talking about a local hospital, your local media is talking about a local hospital doing layoffs, you know, because you have evidence right in front of you, whether your colleagues have been, laid off, whether you're having a harder time getting a hospital bed, whatever it is. So in terms of whether people have a reason to distrust, sure, I think there have been some historical problems over the years. I think a lot of media organizations live in a liberal, or not even liberal, but a coastal media bubble. I think there have been some corrective steps taken recently to get outside of that coastal bubble, but I think the national news organizations generally focus way too much on Washington, Los Angeles, New York, what happens there. There have been some major mistakes in the media. The lead up to the Iraq War, 2003, I think that did a lot to engender distrust of the media. That's the feedback I get from people when I ask them about what they trust. So sure, I think there have been mistakes over the years. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think those high-profile mistakes really take their toll.
Yeah.
The cumulative effect of those. I mean, people know about the Dan Rather scandal, about Brian Williams exaggerations, things like that. So that certainly, I think, plays a pretty significant role. I will use the word liberal. I mean, I do think that there is a liberal bubble, and that too often people have gotten their news over the years through this particular ideological prism. And, you know, given the fact that a lot of the skepticism, I would say a disproportionate amount of the skepticism of the media today comes from the right, that helps explain it. I think conservatives have long believed, myself included, that you can't get unbiased, straight news reporting, whether you're talking about national newspapers, whether you're talking about the television networks, what have you. And so increasingly conservatives looked for alternatives to those media sources. Now, conservative sources certainly have their own problems, and that to a certain extent explains the polarization that we're seeing right now. But I do think that the ideological bias over the years has created or helped create this distrust, particularly among the right half of the political spectrum.
So how do we get out of this problem that we ask people what their trust is in the media, but each one of you is representing a single media organization? So how does your media organization think about dealing with that question of trust when you can't affect all of the other media organizations? Whoever wants to weigh in.
But I mean, I'll jump in. I don't speak for NPR. Sort of as an ombudsman, I'm independent of the newsroom. But I can tell you what the thinking in the newsroom is basically that there's been a concerted effort to kind of put your head down, do the work. Again, so there's trustworthy media. There's media that's maybe less trustworthy. You can enumerate sort of what trustworthy media is. You correct mistakes. You are transparent. You engage with readers and listeners in the audience. There are markers of trustworthy media. I think NPR has made a concerted effort to basically say we are going to stick to those. We're going to stick to those principles and put our heads down and do the job, and be as transparent as possible, be more transparent, if you will. I mean, that's part of what the ombudsman's role is to bring some transparency to the organization. It's not necessarily a battle you can win. It's not necessarily a battle you can fight, other than sort of doing your job and sticking to your work.
I mean, in terms of, I know that a lot of the news organizations, including CNN, they do their own internal polling and surveys to try to understand what the audience thinks of them. And CNN, as far as I understand, they haven't experienced a major hit on what people thought of CNN in terms of like credibility and things like that now versus, let's say, 3 years ago or so. But obviously, it's like one of the major things that we're all talking about now. And I mean, I do think that the transparency aspect is a really important part of it. And I think, owning up to, like you said, mistakes, which, CNN has had a high profile incident of this. I was not there, so I don't know necessarily the entire backstory. I just joined 6 months ago. But people liked to point fingers and laugh at that and say, oh, fake news CNN, when in fact, by doing that, that should bolster your credibility. That should bolster that, no, we do care about the truth, and we do care about how to properly report something, and we will act on it if it is not properly done. And I think that a lot of reporters initially might have been worried about how we were being perceived, and have decided, a certain segment of them have decided to just put their, like what you said, put their heads down and just do work as best as they can and try to continue to do their unbiased work. And people can interpret the result of that however they might, and especially now that so many journalists have their own certain kind of brands. I don't feel like you can, even when it comes down to different media organizations, like when you have like a network that CNN or Fox News that have opinion hosts and what you might call straight anchors and people who are kind of in the middle still doing interviews, it's a much different environment now for people to interpret. And so people are even ascribing, I hear people say, oh, I love Jake Tapper, I trust everything that he says, but I can't stand Don Lemon. And they're from the same network, but an individual will take their own interpretation from different journalists because they are now seen as their own sort of entity.
Yeah, just speaking specifically to what the Weekly Standard did. So I took the editor-in-chief job in January of 2017. And we thought it was important to try to take concrete steps to address this problem, in part because of what we'd seen over the past several years in the deterioration of trust in the media, and also because we felt a sense of obligation. So we did two things right away. The first was we went to our owner and asked him to invest in reporting. You know, we're a conservative journal of opinion. We call ourselves a conservative journal of opinion. But we thought it was very important at a time when people are more and more skeptical of what they're being given by news organizations across the ideological spectrum to sort of go back to the basics and say, we're going to find out what happened. We're happy to have a debate about what happened and to talk about which policies would be best based on what happened, but we're going to find out what happened and report that. And the second thing we did was we joined Facebook's fact-checking program. We were the first paid partner in Facebook's fact-checking program. We had been critical as an institution for years of fact-checking in that we thought it skewed left. We thought several of the organizations that had gained prominence by doing fact-checking leaned to the left. And I think there are numbers to bear that out. In my view, it wasn't good enough for us to sit on the sideline and whine about that fact. We could go in and check facts ourselves. And so we decided to do that. And in that undertaking, we're not seeking out conservative facts or liberal facts. We're looking for facts. And we want to call out social media stories that are truly fake news or exaggerate things. We call out politicians, commentators, media outlets that we think are purveyors of either fake news or less than accurate news or what have you. And that's been a good program for us. We think we're real proud of what we've done in a year and 3 months so far, and we feel like we're just getting started.
I mean, there's also a news literacy movement afoot that I think quite a number of publications are engaging in to sort of combat this. So you'll see the Washington Post is doing videos explaining how I got this story and why we did the story and how we got it and the steps we took very transparently. I think it's the Washington Post as well. Sort of if you hover over something that's opinion versus analysis versus news story, it explains exactly what that is. There have been a lot more panels, I think, in the industry just sort of explaining how we do our work. It's been quite surprising to me the number of people who, when you talk about an anonymous source, they do not understand that an anonymous source is not anonymous to the reporter. Yeah, it's true. It's the basics of our profession, but we don't do a good enough job of explaining it to people. So I think you're seeing many more initiatives along those lines to sort of explain, here's how we do our work, here's the underpinnings, and at least be transparent in that way.
And I think the transparency aspect is key. I mean, this is we're dealing with a series of knotty questions that don't have easy answers as a general rule. That's an easy answer, it seems to me. And I would point to the Washington Post story that broke open the Roy Moore scandal. Long story, exhaustively reported and researched. And I don't know, 7, 8 paragraphs in, maybe it was a little bit further down, they had a chunk of the story that explained detail by detail why they did what they did, how they came to meet the sources. They walked readers through exactly how they had assessed the sources' credibility independent of one another, that the sources didn't know one another, that some of the sources were Republicans, some of the sources were Donald Trump supporters. I mean, it gave it, I think, this air of unimpeachability that made it a lot easier for the lay reader just to read, but in the subsequent debates about it. I mean, I finished the story, and my initial thought off the top of my head was, hard to imagine how this story is not true, how this story is not accurate, assuming that what they laid out for us in terms of the reporting process was accurate. And it made a difference in the way, certainly in the way I talked about it from that point on, the way that our magazine addressed it, I think the way that other journalists addressed it, because you read that story and it was pretty clear that they had done detailed, comprehensive, and credible reporting.
But you still had very loud voices saying that it wasn't true, that it was fake. And
Oh, tell me about it.
yeah, so I mean, I agree that laying it out, and I've also started to notice, especially in print reporting and in our written print, really it's also like digital now, is not just saying according to a source familiar with the situation, but explaining a source familiar with the situation who declined to have their name published because they were not authorized to speak on the record, or they feared retribution or something like that. Whereas I feel like even 3 years ago, we would just say according to 3 sources or something like that, and it would be less specific. Not even specific, but less explanatory.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are pointing towards transparency as a way forward for journalism right now. I think what gets lost in that conversation, and you can all probably speak to this even better than I can, is that a lot of news readers are reading at a very superficial level at this point, right? So you read the Washington Post story. I thought it was gripping, but I don't think that we can count on the average news reader to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes on that kind of deep dive. And I think the research shows that people don't pay that much attention to the hovering over kind of transparency measures. So what do we do with that?
Well, no, it's true, and that has been a challenge. I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but the number of people who only read headlines these days, and that is essentially what social media is. You're passing around headlines, right? So at NPR, they've made much more of an effort to focus on the headline, to make sure the headline is accurate, to make sure, it's not clickbaity, et cetera. Right, because people aren't necessarily engaging on a deep level. At least there's a certain segment of the population that is not engaging with the news at a deep level. Part of that is the responsibility of news consumers, right? We can't take responsibility for their behavior, but we can, knowing their behavior, at least make as much of an effort as possible to encapsulate our values in the headline, say.
And there's a chicken or egg question, I think, at the heart of the polarization debate. I mean, are people consuming this media and as a result are more polarized, or are they just polarized and then they go and seek out what they want? I mean, I think there's a little bit of both, but it's certainly the case that if you're wearing a team uniform, if you're wearing red or blue, you read these things with an eye toward what's going to confirm your presuppositions. Obviously, there's lots of academic literature that suggests that. That's a huge factor, and I don't think transparency does, for exactly the reasons you suggest. Transparency doesn't not only doesn't solve that problem, doesn't really address that problem. If people just get to the thing and they think, I don't believe this. I like Roy Moore. He's a Republican. Who cares about what these women said? I mean, that's a bigger challenge, and transparency was the easy solution of the day that I was offering. I don't have one for the other stuff.
I mean, but I think that these issues have probably always existed, and now they are magnified and amplified because of social media and things like that. There have always been people that only read the headlines or didn't dig deep. It's easier to do so now, but it's also, you could argue, easier to understand more about an issue, because before, if you just had a paper and you only had the next step of what happened in, tariffs right now, you wouldn't necessarily be able to really quickly grab all the background about it if you wanted to. And one thing that I always talk about is not to say that the older generation is lost, but that we really should be focusing on news literacy starting younger and starting in schools. These panels are wonderful, but when I was in high school, I was never taught how to read journalism or to read or consume the news. I took journalism classes. I was on my school newspaper. We learned how to create it, but I wasn't really even taught. And something I learned later in college, because I actually majored in journalism. And I don't know if this is happening now, but it would be wonderful if all English classes were required to teach how to be a smart news consumer and walk you through how to recognize what's opinion, what's not opinion, how to recognize bias, understanding the basics of anonymous sources, understand different outlets and where they might be coming from and what sort of outlets they are, and then how to challenge your own biases, which you definitely have in high school at that point, and read something else and be a little bit more open to it. I don't know if that would work, but I'm sure it would be helpful.
Yeah, so media literacy was on my list to talk about as well, actually, so that's a good segue. I think that's another, so transparency I think is a big thing that the journalism community has been talking about. Media literacy I think is something that the misinformation community has been talking a lot about, which is something I'm a little bit more tied into. And I think partly it's just trying to grab, things that sound good, right? We'll just educate the people and then everything will be fine. But I think that there is a counter to that, which came up earlier today, which is talking about skepticism, right? So for a long time, I think there's been a move in the education system to increase skepticism in general of government, of media, of all the institutions that we've been talking about today, and to encourage people to read things with a cautious eye. And I wonder if you think that that has led to some of the distrust that we now see in the media itself. So are we seeing what is essentially a media literacy backlash right now, or are you chalking that up to something else?
Well, I will say, based on my inbox, that there are a certain number of NPR listeners who hate listen, right? So they basically...
those have always existed.
Fair enough. Okay, true enough. But it's gone up. I've been in my role 3 years. I think it's gone up. I have, a few correspondents who just basically, they listen to NPR and they're waiting just to pounce. I spend some time going back and forth with them, and so I do think that is out there. I think it's been encouraged. I think there's an entire industry out there to encourage sort of mistrust in media outlets. I think it serves some interests, right? So, I don't know how you counter that, frankly.
There's a lot of that. I think you're right. There is an industry that sort of thrives on this, actually, on both the left and the right. I don't think it comes from the schools. I mean, I don't think people are taught in the schools that they ought to be skeptical of media organizations. Certainly that wasn't, I went through public schools in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. I didn't have that. I do think, to just develop a little bit of what I said earlier, I do think that with the sort of proliferation of media outlets and the availability of so many different places to go get your media, we're getting sort of what might be the flip side of transparency in media, where you're having people who write stories or talk about their experiences working in particularly mainstream media outlets, like Bernie Goldberg's book about what he had experienced inside of CBS was something that I don't think got a lot of attention in the mainstream media, but certainly in conservative media it got a ton of attention. I mean, he was everywhere for a long time. And again, I think that starts from somewhere. I think if you read the details of his criticism of some of the things that happened at CBS while he was there, and you believe that what he's telling you is true, and I have no reason really to doubt him, that's a problem. It was a problem that CBS at that time was this cocoon that we were talking about earlier. And eventually news consumers see that. I mean, it's not, people pick up on this stuff. The fact that Dan Rather stuck with his story for as long as he stuck with his story and then still is out there on shows today commenting on media performance. It might not strike other people as problematic. It strikes me as really problematic that Dan Rather's out there talking about these things after insisting that his fake documents, yes, they might have been fake, but they were accurate. The big story was accurate. Well, no, it matters whether they were real or whether they weren't real. And you click around and see Dan Rather talking about media performance, and you stop and think, oh, geez, I don't know that I'm going to believe this anymore.
So several of you have mentioned different bubbles that you see of kind of incorporating the journalistic community right now in terms of a coastal bubble or an ideological bubble. Speaking earlier, we were talking about the gender of sources is not as diverse as we might like it to be. Are there concrete actions that you see organizations taking to address these things? Are there concrete actions that you have in mind that you think would help? Or
there's so many ideas. Okay. If I had all the money and all the resources in the world.
You have all the money.
So I always go back to Selena Zito, who I profiled when I was at Politico. I did a profile on her because she was a reporter who used to work, I think at one of the Pittsburgh newspapers, and got laid off years ago. It was sort of freelancing, and during the election, she was writing these stories about pretty much saying like Trump was going to win. She's like, Trump's going to win Pennsylvania. She lives, in some areas that people like to call Pennsyltucky instead of, this isn't Philly. And I remember her being mocked on social media for writing stories about how like Trump had won over a bar full of Democrats and independents at a debate. And people were like, oh, one bar isn't going to determine, but she recognized something because she lives there and she talks to these people and their kids go to the same schools, and she also matched it with data that she saw based off of certain counties and demographics and things like that. And I think that I did mention this in the call we had when we were talking about this panel, but the death of local media is directly, I think, tied to the decrease in trust in national media, and also why people said the media got the election wrong. Now, I can't guarantee that if we had had robust local media, we would have seen this coming, but I always point to Selena as kind of an example of when you're living and breathing and writing about these people, you just have a better sense. The parachuting in that a lot of national media does to stories, you can't do the same thing. You don't get the same sort of story. You're there for a few days. You don't know the same types of people. You're not talking to them every single day, and they also don't trust you. They're not going to talk to you the same way if they know that you live down the street and your kids go to the same school and you go see the same doctor. And honestly, a lot of the bureaus for TV have been shutting down. I mean, CNN used to have like a Denver bureau, a St. Louis bureau, like everywhere. And now we still have a decent number of bureaus, more so than honestly most organizations have, but we're still flying people into a lot of different places. Politico, I think, has actually started to go in the other direction, but they're focusing on state capitals, and they're covering what's happening at the state capitals, which I think is still really important, because some state capitals, you go there, and the local press corps covering what's happening at the state level, which is honestly the equivalent of what would happen in a country's parliament somewhere else, because those bills really affect people's day-to-day lives in that state, is minuscule. There's like maybe 4 reporters roaming around. And then here on Capitol Hill, you can't even move in the hallways because there's so many reporters. And so Politico has started hiring for specific, like Politico New Jersey, Politico Florida, Politico California. And I think they're doing good work, and they're approaching it in a way that can still make money, but is at least covering some local issues. But I mean, if I had it my way, news organizations would at least have, like CNN would at least have 1 to 2 reporters who lived in every single state and would be that state's correspondent that could then report back to CNN. But I'm not yet president of CNN.
Give it time.
So I can speak a little bit to that. NPR is a content producer, right, for public radio. So NPR, public radio, more broadly, which is the local stations that make up the network and subscribe to the NPR content, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So you have a complicated public radio system in this country. It is an amazing system that has historically been underused when it comes to news coverage. So you've had a very centralized NPR newsroom based in DC. As I said earlier, sort of big bureaus in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, some bureaus around the country, some correspondents, but that's varied over time. On the other hand, you have this amazing resource and network of several hundred, 300 public radio stations that are in all these local communities, all over the country, in the tiniest little communities. In some places, they are the only news source for their communities. The journalism capacity of those stations varies widely. You have some stations that are very active with newsrooms. They've found funding for it. You have others that do very minimal amounts of news, that they're essentially a pass-through for NPR programming. Public radio, CPB, NPR have had a big initiative underway for the past couple of years, trying to really take that asset and make something of it. So you have the decline in local media. They're trying to bolster the capacity of those local radio stations generally. So there's a culture of journalism project that's going on across the entire public radio system that's really helping some of the less developed public radio stations bring their work up to speed. They're trying to find money. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is trying to sort of bring some money into those organizations to cover state houses. So they had an initiative a couple years ago that really focused on covering state houses, building up that capacity. And then other leg of it, which is taking a pretty long time to come together, from my perspective, is really integrating that local eyes and ears capability with the national newsroom. Now that means that the national newsroom is going to have to give up some control over deciding what's news, which voices we're going to hear from, what story is important. Historically, all those decisions are made in Washington, in the Washington headquarters. But if the system, which is still several years out, eventually comes together, it will bring together all of these sort of news gathering sources and hopefully give some of that local flavor and some of the sort of that local expertise, help it inform the national news.
One of the things, again, speaking about what we've done at the Weekly Standard is we've tried to make sure that we have people from all over the country. And we've sort of broken with past tradition of having everybody here in Washington, which made a certain amount of sense, and allowing people to stay out in the country. So we've got a top editor in Ohio. We've got a reporter who's based in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've got people elsewhere. We've got someone in upstate New York. We've got people elsewhere. We have a pretty small staff. So we have a good chunk of our staff. We've just sent somebody down to Georgia, moved them out of DC. So we don't want to be in a DC bubble, although I think that's unlikely. We've got a lot of people from all over the place, and most of us don't like DC that much anyway. So we're unlikely to sort of adapt to our surroundings that way. But it's been helpful. You know, these reporters and these editors have different story ideas based on where they are geographically. You know, we have a story meeting every Friday. It's an hour-long writers meeting where we all sit around, and nobody's allowed to assign stories. You're not allowed to pitch a story that somebody else should do, and you have no fear of being assigned a story yourself in this hour-long meeting. So it's meant to be a free-for-all, even though the editors get together right afterwards and assign all these stories. So it really is a free-for-all, and we get some of the very best story ideas from our people outside of DC. And I don't think it's because they're that much more creative than those of us here, although I'm open to that possibility. I think it has much more to do with the fact that they're living a different life. They're seeing things differently. We talk about entitlement reform and $21 trillion in debt, and it means a certain thing to those of us who might have been at a think tank panel with a bunch of economists who are talking about the long-term implications of this. It means something very different to somebody at home, or back in Wisconsin where I'm from, or in Ohio or what have you. So it's been very helpful to generate stories sort of from the inside of the country out.
Great. So another trend that people talk a lot about in journalism right now is data journalism. You brought up briefly that was an aspect of reporting that can be powerful. Do you see that playing a role in helping to kind of reverse these numbers of trust? Does data help people to trust the media more, or is that a pipe dream?
I mean, I don't know. People don't trust polling anymore, and that's where a lot of data comes from. And I think data journalism is really useful and can be useful in especially covering local governments or talking about regulations or something like that. But I think for the readers, I hear a lot of skepticism from people, even how the data was sourced, where it came from, and the bias that exists in the data and how it was collected. But I still think it's valuable, and it can lead to really fascinating stories, and data journalism has led to real change, especially I think at the local level, when I've seen some just really amazing data journalism talking about NPR right now is doing the maternal deaths series, which is incredible. Right. And that's using a lot of data in there, and that's really affecting people's lives, and you can't really argue with death rates, I would say, from a hospital.
People will try.
They will try, exactly. Yeah, you get the wide range. Again, there are people who love NPR's data-driven reporting. NPR had a story last week that was about looking at some of the data involved with school shootings and whether they'd gone up or down since the 1990s, and the the fear has gone up, but the number of mass shootings has actually gone down. And my inbox was full of people who were furious that NPR did that story because it didn't fit their narrative, and they felt that data wouldn't help them make their political point, right? So, I wrote back and said, that's the kind of story NPR ought to be doing. I mean, that's the whole point of journalism, is to give people the information they need to make informed decisions or come up with informed, thoughts. But people, clearly had a political, viewpoint that they wanted to bolster, and so they didn't like it when the data didn't fit their, didn't fit their idea, and they thought it was going to hurt them, and so they lashed out at the news organization for doing the reporting.
What's the saying? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Right.
Well, we've had a lot of the same kind of challenges from our readers, and maybe it could be a blessing or a curse, but every time I get those kind of challenges, I tend to dig in more. Okay, well, we'll do more. Well, I don't want to be, I've said this before, but I don't want to be, again, editor of a conservative journal of opinion, I don't want to be a place that people come solely for affirmation. I want them to come for information, and we're determined to provide it. Damn it, whether they want it or not. And we've got. I was editing a story this morning on. It's going to be a terrific story on homelessness, and we had a reporter who was out in Seattle, which is one of the cities in the country that's seen a tremendous spike, 44% increase in homelessness in Seattle since 2015, I believe. Extraordinary. The same thing's happening in San Francisco, a couple other places, largely due to rents, but also some additional drug problems. And the piece is statistics laden. I think he does a masterful job in actually telling the stories too, which is really important. But there are a lot of statistics in there, and we will have charts and graphs and everything. We will get grief for the. He's not at the end of the piece pushing any particular policy prescription for this. He's sort of just observing this and giving it, putting a story behind it. He's not saying, therefore we should do all of these things, or we should ask the government to step in and do X, Y, and Z. He's just saying this is a real problem. And I think it's a lot more persuasive because of the data that he uses. And maybe people will react the same way and just won't believe it or won't want to read it. But I feel like we have an obligation to provide that information, to make that case, so that we can then start with those facts, and then let's have a big, messy, ugly debate about what we ought to do about it.
Definitely. So you're sitting in a room full of academics. Are there questions that you wish academics were answering right now about journalism, about what you're doing, either about kind of your outlets and how they could do things differently, or about these kind of broader institutional questions about media?
How do we make more money?
Yeah, I was about to say the business.
Write that down.
Yeah, the business of media, I think, is really important. Like, what are you? Because we have seen some success stories in the media, but and I don't think we're ever going to find like the silver bullet that works. But what are people willing to pay for? How much are they willing to pay? I mean, we've said, should everyone go into the NPR model? You guys seem to be doing pretty well this past year.
Right.
But that's probably going to change in coming years. I mean, we're seeing, I think that's the biggest question, pushing journalism, especially at the local level. Like, what do people want, and what are they willing to pay for when it comes to local journalism? What do they care about? I think if they're willing to pay, I don't know, $10 a month for Hulu, are they willing to pay $10 a month for your local news station? I don't know. Depends on what content it provides. Should Hulu get into the local news business and provide local news alongside, your cartoons? I don't know.
When it comes to media trust issues, I'm really curious in seeing those numbers broken out by racial and ethnic sectors. I've looked at a fair amount of the numbers, a fair amount of the data out there. I don't have a good sense of how media trust issues are broken down in various segments of the population. So I'd actually be quite interested in that.
I guess I'd be interested in a very general answer to a general question, and the answer might already exist. You probably already know these answers, and I don't. Is there more interest in the media? among the general populace today as opposed to 4 years ago or 10 years ago or what have you. Certainly based on my own experiences, and I know that we're not supposed to do this, but repeatedly, if I go speak to groups around the country, it doesn't matter where they are, it doesn't really matter the ideological makeup of the group. At this point, I would say my Q&A sessions are 75% questions about the media. Never happened before. I'd get a question or two, and it was usually is Bill O'Reilly really such a, whatever. The questions now, and I speak more to probably center-right audiences than other audiences, are detailed, and they know the names of individual reporters, and they're worried about specific stories, and they almost all come from exactly the kind of skepticism and lack of trust that we're talking about today. And I'd be interested to know if that's representative or how representative.
I would also be interested in a survey of like an survey of like high schools and who is teaching media literacy and how, and whether there's a trend in people teaching more media literacy.
Okay, I definitely want to leave time for the audience, but I have one more question, which is technically two questions, to finish up. So one question that I kept coming back to this morning is, how do you see trust in the media as part of a broader trend that we've been talking about in terms of trust in politics and trust in other institutions, trust in religion, trust in science? And to what extent do you see it separate from that? What aspects are different? And number two, what do you think happens in the next 10 years? Does this keep going? Does
my gosh.
Do we bottom out at some point and rebound? Should we be hopeful or pessimistic?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. I'm guessing that we are riding a wave right now that will eventually crash, and there will be another scramble to figure out how to keep journalism alive. And I don't know if that's going to mean I personally think we're heading more towards the subscription-based. I mean, if you look at how people consume their television and their media now, it might go towards that direction. I think using advertising to sustain journalism is going to die out eventually. That or we're going to see, I mean, you could kind of think about the NPR model almost like a subscription basis, because people who are regular donors, they almost see it as like a subscription service. And if people are willing to pay for podcasts and things like that, I don't know. And as for your first answer, I have no idea. Your first question.
A couple thoughts. In terms of where we are in 10 years in media trust, I mean, I do think media trust, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, so it was very low during Watergate, and then it spiked quite high when Nixon left office. So I think that was a case where sort of media audiences could see sort of a connection to the two, right? So you can distrust the reporting, and then at some point it turned out to be true, right? So I think there's probably the business model for the way people consume media has changed quite a bit since then, but I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but I'm interested to see sort of how media trust correlates with actually what happens in the world. And to the extent that people can see their reporting, that the reporting is confirmed or not. In terms of how media sort of interacts with all these other trends, again, so the role of journalism is to give people the information they need to make informed decisions. Even if you don't trust the media, I still don't have a good question about whether, my sense is that people are still using the information from media that they say they don't trust to make those decisions, right? So I would love to see actually more of an understanding of how much those trends actually intersect, right? If you distrust the media, but you still ultimately see that the reporting is true, Roy Moore or whatever, does that actually inform your decision making? Mm-hmm. So.
So I don't know is the honest answer to your first question. Although I think my gut suggests that they're related. If you look at the in particular the scandals that have almost certainly affected trust in big institutions broadly, whether you're talking about Iraq and WMD, whether you're talking about the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church, whether you're talking about the banks and the 2008. I mean, there's a lot of evidence. Whether you're talking about places we go for distractions like sports and doping scandals and things like that. It just feels to me like they're somehow related. And I don't have anything science-y to make that argument. As for the latter, I'm not terribly optimistic about where this goes. I was wrong, as wrong could be 10 years ago when I thought the proliferation, the democratization of media would lead to more and better journalism, and it just hasn't. I mean, in some cases it has, but it's I think created all sorts of problems where a place like Gateway Pundit, which is a conservative outlet that often peddles fake news, has a White House press pass. You've seen other outlets that do that gain in popularity. I think that's a huge problem. As for what Hadass says, I certainly hope we continue to move toward the subscription model. And if any of you are interested, we're running a special at the Weekly Standard right now.
Can I make one note about the Gateway Pundit's press pass? This is a misconception, and the Gateway Pundit definitely has access to the White House that in previous administrations they would not have had. But any random news organization can get a daily pass. They do not have the hard pass that gives them the full access that.
Then I'm guilty of peddling fake news,
Exactly.
accusing them of being guilty of peddling fake news.
So I mean,
Live
yes, they
fact-checking,
do.
ladies
But
and
like
gentlemen.
any news organization, the thing is now is that we're seeing more of those types of news organizations try to get daily press passes. The White House does not want to be in. We were afraid they were going to be in the business of denying access to the briefing room for whatever reason they wanted to, and they have smartly decided to not be the arbiter of who is news and who is not. So you've always had characters in the briefing room. It's just now there's more of them.
You don't think the White House should be in the business of helping to decide who?
No. I don't think any White House should be in the business of deciding. I think that they can help decide. The Correspondents Association is the one who decides who gets to sit where.
Right.
And that's an elected body that people can apply to and vote in.
Right.
And I think that's luckily the way it stayed, and that the White House has not had any hand in determining who gets that and who does not.
Great. Are there questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone over here and one over here.
Arthur Jackson, I just want to ask, especially in the context of the topic of trust and having Weekly Standard and NPR side by side, CNN can fit in with NPR maybe, about ideological labels, objectivity, and trust. I mean, presumably the Weekly Standard is trusted by its readers because of its ideological label to some degree. Probably NPR is trusted by its devoted, affirming listeners because of their principled objectivity, which is also, I think, kind of arguably a label for them. But then there's also discussion, like maybe say Jay Rosen, for example, about the value of recognizing kind of theoretical flaws in an objectivity model, and maybe people should be more transparent about where they're coming from, and that would help with the trust deficit overall. I was just interested to see if anybody has any opinions on that from your expertise.
Well, we certainly think
professional
people should be
expertise.
transparent about where they're coming from, since we announce ourselves as a conservative journal of opinion. It's an interesting question. I would say that probably most of the people who work at the Weekly Standard believe in an objectivity model, but we also believe in being transparent about where we come from. And I don't think that those are necessarily as in tension as many other people might think. I will confess that I am a loyal and regular listener to NPR. I suppose most people would say, despite the fact that I'm a conservative, I think, because of the fact that I'm a conservative. Now, I think NPR has an ideological bias. I think PBS NewsHour, which I also watch, has a bias. I know that coming in. I sort of factor that in as I take in what I'm seeing, but I love the fact that I can get long, in-depth reported pieces at places like that. I would prefer not to ever pay anything for it. But sorry.
It's okay.
I mean, I would pay for it myself. I just don't want
You
to.
don't want the federal funds to the local stations.
Yes.
Got it. Fair enough.
I say that, one last disclaimer. My wife used to work for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. She commissioned documentaries there for several years. And it was an odd tension in our household because I loved the work she was doing. I was very proud of her. She was great at it. And I wanted to zero out her budget.
There you go. Yeah, you know, there isn't a really good research. We were talking about this earlier. There really isn't good research as to who listens to NPR. The latest data that we have is really from 2014. I get that question a lot from listeners. You know, well, isn't your audience overwhelmingly liberal? You know, my anecdotal sense is it is not, but we don't really know who actually listens to NPR. My sense is that there's probably quite a few conservatives who do listen, probably not far right, but you know, NPR has chosen its model. Jay doesn't like it. He's been very clear about that. So, you know, the sense in the newsroom is that, you know, they've got their model and they're going to stick to it. So.
I guess I've always been a fan of the old school objective approach to being a reporter. I'm, you know, a registered independent. My friends always try to figure out who I voted for, and they're convinced either way, depending on who you talk to. But I do recognize that when people think of their ideal time period of, you know, the Walter Cronkites or whatever, that's not how it's always been in media in our country's history. If you look back, you know, 100 years ago more, there were biased news organizations and who were sponsored sometimes by political parties themselves, and that's where people got their information from, and we survived thus far. And I used to be I've been a journalist now for 6 years or so
Mm-hmm.
I'm still new to this world, to the professional journalism world. I studied it for a long time, but I used to poo-poo the biased outlets or you know, the Weekly Standard or something like that, saying they're not objective, so they can't produce good work. And I have changed my mind on that because I have seen really amazing work come out of some of these outlets, whether it be the Daily Caller, which sometimes does crazy things and sometimes does very good reporting, or Mother Jones and Think Progress. And I think it all just comes down to being a smart news consumer and, you know, like Steve was saying, recognizing what you're getting, where you're getting the information from, and being able to interpret it in your own way. Because I don't think that we are ever going to go back to that kind of objective, unless I just don't think we're going to go back to that world of objectivity that people think that we somehow lived in. And even then, there were times where, you know, the Walter Cronkites or whatever were going out and doing these big stories. I think there was one about like the farm workers or something that was criticized at the time for being biased in some way. And so even then you were dealing with that. So objectivity is a great thing to strive for, and I would argue that I try to be objective, but I'm sure you talk to all my readers and they would say, she's this way or she's that way, but I don't know. Existential question.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I think this is the third panel, so I try to make a little bit consolidated. I think about the democracy, we have to think about the government is really run not just by for or of the people, but they are really consist of the people. They are the people elected to the official positions. So they are really the people produced by our society. So each of us has a responsibility to produce those. The problem is now the corporation or lobbyists, they spend a lot of money and also manipulate our society to produce those to those positions. So I think the media or civic organization or lower political party, they are responsible mostly because when they screen the candidate in such a way, they don't really produce candidate forum in such a fair manner. So now for media, you have a capability, you have facilities, you can live broadcast, or you can have taped website so people can see it. Currently, a lot of those local media, they are produce false information or suppress false information about the official misconduct, or even fraudulent criminal network. They produce those corruption officials. So I think that Russia and China, they are anti-corruption. They did such a pretty good job. But America, they try to drain the swamp, but I don't see anywhere they go the right direction. So the media can do the candidate forum, not just soundbite. Soundbite doesn't make any sense. And a lot of distortion. You should have a full story. The problem is currently the media don't produce full story. So the whole thing is real distortion, and it keep really busy, that's all. Now we have to have education. Not just the students, but also officials and administrators. The way they do things is upside down. We have to really change this around, and I hope the media can really do their responsibility. It's such an important job for our society, actually for your own sake, and for your children's sake, and for your parents' sake. So I really think we have to work together, the school, the education facilities, and even the university. A lot of lobbyists and a civic organization or think tank, they are doing the opposite direction. They put some propaganda there and use some kind of terminology or something like phrase that attract people's attention, but that's really this type of what I call is a corruption network.
Sure. So do you see the role of the media in fighting corruption and maybe collaborating with other institutions?
I mean, I would argue that the media is doing a lot to try to fight corruption. I mean, we've seen already several, I don't know if some people would not call it necessarily corruption, but there was plenty of stories that were uncovered by the media of cabinet secretaries, trading stocks maybe that were directly tied to what the agency they were covering, or all the debates over the travel, the private planes, and how much that cost taxpayers, or Ben Carson's $31,000 dining room set. Those are all things that were uncovered by the media.
Yep.
Great. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Nora Gordon. I'm a professor here at the McCourt School, and thank you for coming today. And thanks, John, for a great conference. I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to the role of expertise in your coverage, and thinking about, well, if you are having so much trouble getting a reader to believe a fact that you can back up with data, if you're going one step further to a statement like climate change is real or coal jobs are not coming back, where it's less, you can't link it to a particular number, but if you're trying to communicate the extent of consensus in expert opinion on some of these things, and when there is always going to be someone with a PhD who will say the non-consensus view. I was thinking about this actually when you were talking about the explanation of the sources and why they wouldn't go on the record, or just sort of providing more context for the reader or the viewer. Is there appetite for that, or do you think people just don't even care what experts say anyway?
I mean, like you said, there's always experts with opposing points of view, and there's no god of, different subjects, like god of climate change that gets to determine what's fact and what's not. I do think that there is value in providing different experts. I mean, CNN has hired a lot of panelists who are, former FBI officials or professors or academics, something like that. I think there's value in it, but I do think there is still a role for the journalist to play to help interpret that information and provide the different viewpoints. I don't have data or know whether how readers interpret that versus the others. I do think that when readers see the data, the raw data, I think that I know that they, at least readers who talk to me, they appreciate being able to see the raw data versus just the journalist's interpretation of it, whether that means the crosstabs of a poll or raw data from like Health and Human Services or something like that. It's tough to wade through, and not all of them open it, even read it, but I think that it goes back to the transparency thing, where it makes people feel like we're not hiding anything. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
Thank you. A little bit about how so there's always experts who will be on both sides, but on some issues, it's really almost everybody on one side, whereas on others, it'll be much more mixed. And so, how that can be communicated to your audiences.
I mean, that gets to the false equivalency question that we spend a lot of time talking about, right? So on climate change, you have, 98% of the scientists, are on one side, 2% are on another. I mean, at some point, a news organization has an obligation to say this is what the two sides aren't equal, right? It's not that we have two sides, it's that we have 98% on one side versus 2% on the other side. You don't have to ignore the other 2%. You can have an interpretation. The data is what the data is, right? And then your policy prescription that follows from that data may be different depending on what political side you're on, but I think it's the journalist's obligation to say, this is what the data say. It's not a two-sided debate.
But it's important to include the data. I mean, one of the things that we
Absolutely.
laugh about at the Weekly Standard and among my right-wing friends is the frequent use and flagrant abuse of the phrase experts say. I mean, so often, if you read this stuff critically, it's just an excuse for the author to insert his or her own view. And there'll be, I'll read a story in the front page of the New York Times that says experts say, and I'll think, gosh, that's interesting. I had dinner with 4 experts who said the opposite last night. Their views aren't really reflected here. So I think when there's overwhelming consensus or even broad consensus, it's important for the reporting to reflect that. And I think we've seen that. I mean, if you look at just the reporting over the past several weeks about questions of tariffs and trades and the impact on the economy of tariffs, you get a pretty good sense that most economists, I think left, right, or center, think that tariffs are not good overall for the economy. They might be good for the steel industry. That's been reflected in the reporting, I think in an important way. It gives people an understanding of what experts in this particular case believe. Now, even our stuff, I mean, we're very pro-free trade magazine. We'll introduce skepticism where it's warranted. We'll say, well, no, on this person makes a valid argument about the effects of the steel tariffs in 2002 on these specific companies in this specific industry. So we'll lay out the fact that there's a dispute there if warranted. But I think we've seen some of what you're suggesting in the recent reporting.
We had an interesting case last week that came into my office. NPR had a report about political spending in Pennsylvania 18, which was overwhelmingly Republican, right? The Republican numbers were much higher than the Democrat spending numbers. So the correspondent talked about the $10 million of Republican outside money. Did not mention the Democrat numbers at all. And so we got people who were upset because they felt like we were demonizing the Republicans. I was sort of saying, well, I mean, the reporter was correct, and I don't remember the exact numbers. I think it was 10 million versus 2 million, right? Wasn't it 10 versus 2? Okay, so the reporter was correct. The 10 million is the much more newsworthy story. If you're trying to tell a story in shorthand, yeah, you focus on the 10 million, but it introduced a level of skepticism by not sort of coming back and saying, okay, here is what the Democrat number was. It was 2 million. You could make your own judgment on that. So I understand why the report was done the way it was. It was a short period of time. It was less than 3 minutes. They were trying to communicate it in shorthand. That said, by not putting all the statistics in, it introduced an element of what these listeners saw as bias. So.
Hi, I'm Avram Reisman. I'm a MA candidate in the Democracy and Governance program in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. This semester, I'm working with a team of other students to put together a report for USAID on electoral violence and how journalists should cover it. And in the process of that, I've looked into political violence and also the principles of conflict-sensitive journalism. Do you think that, well, first of all, are you familiar with any editorial guidelines at your organizations surrounding covering political violence? And in addition, do you think that given the environment of high tension that we have and political polarization, that perhaps conflict-sensitive journalism should be something that domestic journalists should begin to learn a bit about?
I'm not aware that the ethics code of NPR, we have an ethics handbook online. I don't think there's a special section about that.
So you're asking whether, like, so when you're talking about political violence, you mean like at a rally or something, if somebody gets punched, how we cover that?
Yes. Yeah, like do you report the victims? Like how do you describe things like how do you describe who the affiliation is and what the motivations that might be behind it, whether you name the perpetrator or the victim or what sort of weapon was used?
We definitely have guidelines on certain things, for example, domestic violence and sexual assault, sexual violence, and we definitely have guidelines on all that. In terms of political things, I think I don't know, honestly, about what our necessary guidelines are. We do have a very robust standards group at CNN that review everything, and they have a lot of power. And I'm sure that they get involved whenever there's reporting on, I just personally have not reported on political violence to that end. But I think in my previous reporting on sort of sensitive issues, sometimes it depends on the situation. I mean, if somebody was protesting publicly at a public rally and something happens, who they are is clearly they wanted people to see them. But I definitely, your question about the affiliations, I think, is really interesting, and that's what we're dealing with a lot now. For example, think about Charlottesville, and how do you report on somebody's affiliation? When do you classify it a certain way or a different way? I think those are all questions that we're still dealing with, and that they're always sort of a gray area.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I can think of is the standards editor has put out quite a few memos, particularly around Charlottesville, just asking people to be as specific as possible. So to avoid using broad labels for people and to talk about specifically what this person was protesting, white supremacism versus white nationalism, which is not the same thing as, necessarily the alt-right, et cetera. So to be as specific as is possible from the reporting.
Hi, I'm Disraeli Smith. I'm actually a student at the McCourt School. It seems that, in terms of today's media, there's a lot of pressure, on the media to get it right. 100% of the time to be robots, to be, completely factual, that one wrong fact, one misstated source, one comma in the wrong place, gets an article blasted as fake news or insignificant or things of that nature. How do you guys deal with that pressure from just the general day-to-day? And then on top of that, when you think of reporting reports or stuff with a lot of data and statistical analysis, how do you go about making sure that the conclusions that are being made are actually reported correctly? Because people interpret things in different ways, slant it from different news angles, et cetera.
More wine, I would say, is one of the ways. No, you're right. But honestly, I welcome the scrutiny. I mean, you should welcome the scrutiny. We're in the business of providing facts. We're in the business of being accurate. If you can't do that, you ought not probably be doing this. I'm glad that Hadass corrected what I had said earlier about Gateway Pundit. I guess the way that we try to handle this at the Weekly Standard is if we make an error, when we make an error, we announce it ostentatiously, and we're pretty aggressive about it. Like, hey, we screwed this up. Look over here. This was wrong. So that when people come back to us, and hopefully they do, they'll know that if we make a mistake, we own it. I think that's the best thing for media outlets to do. I guess I don't have any.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way ProPublica made a huge error last week, I don't know if you all saw that. I urge you to look it up, but they did, I mean, it was a terrible error. They handled it, I thought, very, very professionally. So they were very public about it. The editor of ProPublica came on NPR and talked about what a bad mistake it was. And
a detailed explanation of how it happened.
How it happened.
Yeah.
NPR itself had, I think, 3 stories at last count that had incorporated that error in some ways into its own reporting. So the standards editor very quickly the next morning had corrections up. There's now a correction in the audio that he has read, because you can't change the audio record, of course. So our audio lives, in the archives online forever. So they have moved quickly to sort of put a disclaimer at in the audio, which they rarely do. So yeah, I think you have to handle it very forthrightly and quickly and with all deliberation.
There is definitely more pressure, I think, on news organizations. There's always been pressure on news organizations to get it right. I mean, look at the Dan Rather situation. That was such a big deal because we do care about getting things right. I think that the pressure now, I think initially when this administration came in, there was a fear that there would be direct retaliation on news organizations in the form of denied access or something like that. We haven't seen that, and I think that when news organizations every news organization gets things wrong across the board, and then the best news organizations are the ones who did like what ProPublica did and correct them and don't just leave them up, or don't just delete them quietly, or just quietly attach, like fix it in text and not tell anybody about it. And that's what's ironic, is that when these news organizations get called out as fake news, they're actually doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. In terms of your question about data and how you come to the correct conclusion, I don't think any story should ever say definitively, this is the end-all answer to what we're dealing with. You always have to present it as part of, journalism is the first draft of history, and so it's always going to be rolling and changing. And I have been in situations where I'm writing a story and I feel like I can't stop because there's more and more people that I could be talking to and getting more information, gathering it all together. And at a certain point, you have to stop, and you have to just, this goes back to transparency, present it to your reporters and say, out of the 50 people I talked to, here is what they said. Now there's a lot of different interpretations, and these things might be happening in the future that could affect that. And if you're showing your data sets and you're showing what you're looking at, that helps people understand, and it has the readers be a participant in your reporting process and helps them understand they're kind of on the adventure with you. I think any article that presents something as the be-all, end-all of, this is the story, the end, that's a bad story, and you shouldn't read it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Bill Gormley from the McCourt School. I wish I had a solution to the changing economics of journalism, because I worry about that quite a bit. And I think we desperately need to find a solution so that we can have stronger local reporting, especially. I do have a solution to one of the other problems that you mentioned, that is the problem of biased reporting. And I think the solution is critical thinking and critical thinking instruction in our classrooms. So when you talked about the news literacy idea, I think that's really at the heart of news literacy. What's going on in news literacy? You have the News Literacy Project. I think that's a great effort. My sense is that the News Literacy Project has been focusing primarily on a handful of big cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, and New York City. But it has the potential to reach people in other smaller communities, and especially because they're relying more increasingly on electronic opportunities for teachers to engage with their students. That's easier to disseminate. I do think that it's great for high school English teachers, as you suggested, to try to teach students how to recognize bias in news stories, how to distinguish between good evidence and bad evidence, and perhaps most importantly, how to recognize their own biases. And those are some of the hallmarks of critical thinking, really. So to me, I definitely agree with what you suggested. I'd like to see high school English teachers do more of that. But I would also say it needs to begin much earlier. Because if it's only going to begin in the junior and senior years of high school, it's not going to be deep enough, it's not going to be part of children's muscle memory. So these are skills that can be taught successfully in middle school, and they can even be taught successfully in elementary school. And I think if children develop some of these critical thinking skills early on with the talented teachers who scaffold those skills for them, then they will be less desperately in need of news literacy coaching and instruction.
Sorry.
Is that a question? Okay,
Very
I
good.
think we're good. Please join me in thanking our panel.